Hollywood in the 1960s was obsessed with going bigger, louder, and shinier. Studios gambled everything on colossal musicals, sprawling epics, and glossy productions that were supposed to be instant classics. Instead, many of them crashed harder than anyone expected. Some nearly bankrupted their studios. Others just left audiences scratching their heads. What happens when too much glitter sinks the ship? Let's dig into 15 weird box office bombs from the 60s you probably missed. Cleopatra, 1963. This wasn't just a movie. It was a financial roller coaster that almost buried 20th Century Fox alive. Cleopatra was supposed to be the jewel of Hollywood. Lavish sets, thousands of extras, and Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra dazzling audiences across the globe. But behind the glamour, the production was a nightmare. Endless delays, constant rewrites, and Taylor's very public health scares ballooned the budget into something no studio could possibly handle. Originally planned at $2 million, it exploded into a record-shattering $44 million, a figure unheard of for its time. When it finally premiered, audiences were curious but not committed. The film earned money, but nowhere near enough to cover its swollen costs. Critics said it was too long, too heavy, and more spectacle than story. For Fox, the damage was catastrophic. The studio had to sell off parts of its backlot to survive, and insiders whispered that Cleopatra had nearly taken the company down with it. And yet, despite all that chaos, Cleopatra still picked up Oscars for its visuals and costumes. It remains one of the strangest paradoxes in cinema history, a film that technically made money, but was still called a bomb because of how insanely expensive it became. Cleopatra is remembered less for its storytelling and more for being the golden epic that almost ended a Hollywood giant. Dr. Dolittle, 1967. On paper, this had everything. A family-friendly story, a big star in Rex Harrison, talking animals, and a musical format that seemed perfect for the decade. But what audiences got was something else entirely. Dr. Dolittle turned into one of the most notorious misfires of the 60s. A production so overblown, it became a textbook example of Hollywood excess. The budget shot up to around $17 million, a jaw-dropping sum for a light-hearted comedy about a veterinarian who chats with animals. Shooting on location brought endless problems. Horses misbehaved, sets flooded, and exotic animals ran wild, delaying production for months. By the time the movie hit theaters, critics were ready to pounce. Reviews called it dull, overly long, and weighed down by clunky musical numbers that lacked charm. Audiences agreed, staying away in droves. Despite Fox throwing marketing money at it, Dolittle earned back only a fraction of what it cost. Even the studio's attempt to force-feed the film into award season backfired. It picked up 9 Oscar nominations, but that couldn't erase the fact that it was a commercial embarrassment. In the end, Dr. Dolittle became shorthand for a movie that thought money could buy magic. Instead, it proved that no amount of animals or musical numbers could save a film if the heart wasn't there. Today, it's remembered less as a charming children's movie and more as the strange, lumbering flop that symbolized a studio trying too hard to recreate a formula that no longer worked. Star, 1968. Hollywood thought they had another Sound of Music on their hands. Julie Andrews was still one of the biggest stars in the world, and audiences loved her wholesome, pitch-perfect image. So when she headlined Star, a glossy biopic of stage legend Gertrude Lawrence, everyone assumed success was guaranteed. What they got instead was one of the biggest box office belly flops of the decade. The production was drenched in color and glamour, with costumes that sparkled and sets that looked like a dream. Yet, beneath all that shine, the story dragged. Running nearly 3 hours, it felt less like a movie and more like a test of patience. Critics complained that it was too long, too flat, and failed to capture any real spark from its subject. Even Andrews' charm couldn't save it. The box office response was brutal. Paint Your Wagon, 1969. Clint Eastwood singing, Lee Marvin singing. If that sentence sounds surreal, you're not alone. Paint Your Wagon is remembered today less for its story and more for its bizarre casting choices. A Western musical about gold miners who break into song should have been quirky fun, but instead, it turned into one of the oddest box office flops of the decade. With a bloated budget hovering near $20 million, Paint Your Wagon was never going to be a modest project. Shooting in remote mountain locations dragged on endlessly, driving up costs as weather and logistical nightmares slowed everything down. By the time the film finally premiered, audiences were already wary. Reviews called it messy, overlong, and weighed down by actors who weren't exactly born to sing. At the box office, it stumbled badly. Instead of becoming a hit, it barely earned back its cost. Eastwood himself later admitted he was miscast, and Lee Marvin's famously gravelly voice turned his musical numbers into unintentional comedy. Despite all this, Paint Your Wagon has gained a cult reputation. Some viewers embrace its sheer weirdness, treating it as a time capsule of Hollywood at its most experimental and misguided. Watching Eastwood croon, "I Talk to the Trees," is equal parts baffling and unforgettable. In the end, it remains a musical curiosity, a bold swing that missed the target, but left a lasting mark in film trivia. Hello, Dolly, 1969. By the late 1960s, Hollywood was desperate to keep the big-budget musical alive. So when Hello, Dolly arrived with Barbra Streisand in the lead, it was marketed as the last great musical extravaganza. But instead of reviving the genre, it nearly buried it. With a budget pushing $25 million, it was one of the most expensive films of its day. Sets were massive, costumes elaborate, and no expense was spared. But Streisand, still in her 20s, was considered far too young to convincingly play the matchmaker Dolly Levi, a role traditionally portrayed by older actresses. Critics noticed, and they didn't hold back. The movie did earn some money, but nowhere near what was needed to cover its astronomical costs. Audiences were already moving on from musicals, gravitating toward edgier films like Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy. Dolly felt out of touch, a glossy throwback in an era that was craving realism and grit. In the years since, Hello, Dolly has been reevaluated as a piece of grand spectacle. The lavish numbers and Streisand's undeniable singing talent give it a certain nostalgic charm. Yet it remains a textbook example of Hollywood clinging to a dying trend. For all its glitter, it couldn't mask the truth. The age of the big musical was over. Krakatoa, East of Java, 1969. This one didn't just flop. It became a punchline. Krakatoa, East of Java promised a sweeping disaster epic filled with romance, adventure, and one of the largest volcanic eruptions ever put on screen. There was just one problem. Krakatoa is actually west of Java. Yes, the title itself was geographically wrong, and that blunder became a metaphor for the entire production. With a massive budget and special effects that were supposed to wow audiences, the movie had everything going for it. Yet instead of gripping action, audiences got an overlong and confusing mess. The plot meandered through subplots about treasure hunters, doomed lovers, and endless melodrama, all while the so-called eruption was held back until the very end. Critics groaned that it felt like an overstuffed TV movie stretched out for theaters. Financially, it was a disaster on par with the eruption it tried to depict. The marketing leaned hard on spectacle, but audiences simply didn't show up. The title mistake also became a running joke, making it hard for the film to be taken seriously, even before the opening credits rolled. Over time, Krakatoa has lived on mostly as trivia. The effects, which were once marketed as groundbreaking, now look clunky compared to other disaster flicks that came later. Still, it's remembered for its sheer ambition and for being a movie that managed to get its own geography wrong in giant block letters on the poster. When a film can't even get its title right, you know trouble is brewing. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 1964. This wasn't just a flop. It was an empire crumbling in front of the cameras. The Fall of the Roman Empire was one of the most ambitious epics of the 1960s, designed to rival Ben-Hur and Spartacus. Lavish sets, giant battles, and an all-star cast led by Sophia Loren and Christopher Plummer were supposed to guarantee success. Instead, it collapsed under its own weight. The production went all out. A colossal Roman Forum set was built in Spain, one of the largest ever constructed for a film. The budget soared past $19 million, which in the 60s was astronomical. Critics initially admired its scale, but quickly soured on the slow pacing and wooden performances. The story lacked heart, turning what should have been a thrilling spectacle into a bloated lecture. At the box office, it earned less than $5 million domestically, a huge shortfall. For producer Samuel Bronston, who had already gambled big on previous epics, it was the final straw. The movie's failure bankrupted his company, sending a warning to Hollywood that audiences were tired of oversized historical dramas. And yet, some film historians look back more kindly. The film's grandeur, especially its battle scenes and costumes, influenced Ridley Scott's Gladiator decades later. But at the time, Fall of the Roman Empire was exactly what its title suggested: the end of an era for bloated sword and sandal epics. Chitty, Chitty Bang Bang, 1968. It's hard to imagine a movie with flying cars, songs by the Sherman Brothers, and a script by Roald Dahl failing. And yet, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang didn't exactly soar when it first hit theaters. While today it's beloved as a quirky family classic, back in 1968, it was considered an underperformer that left producers scratching their heads. Produced by Albert R. Broccoli, the same man behind the James Bond films, this musical was supposed to be unstoppable. The sets were colorful, the songs were catchy, and the car itself was a technical marvel. But the film ran long, stretching past 2.5 hours, which was a tall order for restless children. Critics said it was charming in parts but uneven and bloated overall. Financially, it stumbled. Despite heavy promotion, it didn't make enough to justify its hefty $10 million budget. Audiences who expected another Mary Poppins-style smash were disappointed, and word of mouth wasn't kind. Over time, however, television reruns and home video gave it new life. Kids fell in love with the flying car and Dick Van Dyke's playful energy, while the child catcher character terrified generations into remembering it forever. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang may have been a flop in its day, but its legacy turned around. Now, it's seen as a nostalgic gem, proof that even a failed movie can find eternal life once families adopt it into their living rooms. Camelot, 1967. This was supposed to be the musical to end all musicals. Based on the smash Broadway hit, Camelot brought the legend of King Arthur to the big screen with Richard Harris, Vanessa Redgrave, and Franco Nero in dazzling costumes. The studio expected another Sound of Music. What they got was a muddled production that drained wallets instead of filling seats. Camelot's budget ballooned to nearly $13 million, and Warner Brothers pulled out all the stops with ornate sets and sweeping cinematography. But when audiences showed up, they got a story that dragged on for nearly 3 hours, with songs that didn't quite ignite. Critics noted that Harris and Redgrave, while fine actors, lacked the chemistry to make the love triangle convincing. The film grossed just enough to limp by, but nowhere near enough to be considered a true success. It did pick up a few Oscars for costume design and art direction, but those couldn't hide the financial disappointment. Worse, it arrived at a time when audiences were shifting toward gritty realism and counterculture cinema. Camelot felt like a relic from another age, hopelessly out of step. Still, for lovers of musicals, Camelot has its defenders. Its lush visuals and earnest performances have given it a cult following. But in the 60s, It stood as proof that Broadway glitz didn't always translate to box office gold. Instead of ruling the kingdom, Camelot found itself exiled. Finian's Rainbow, 1968. Imagine Francis Ford Coppola, years before The Godfather, directing a whimsical musical about leprechauns, gold, and the American South. That's Finian's Rainbow, a film as peculiar as it sounds. It was meant to be a light-hearted magical romp, but instead became a confused, clunky entry that failed to charm audiences. Starring Fred Astaire in one of his last leading roles, the film combined old-school musical traditions with strange fantasy elements. Astaire played Finian, an Irishman who steals a pot of gold and brings it to America, setting off a chain of odd events. Coppola, still finding his voice as a director, struggled to balance the material. The result was a film that felt both dated and out of step with the times. Critics panned it for being overly sentimental and tonally uneven. Younger audiences, who were flocking to counterculture hits like Easy Rider, had no interest in a story about leprechauns. Meanwhile, older audiences found the whimsical fantasy hard to take seriously. The movie's $3.5 million budget wasn't enormous, but its weak returns branded it a flop nonetheless. Still, the film has some fascinating footnotes. Fred Astaire, even in his late 60s, danced with elegance that few could match. And Coppola used the experience to sharpen his directing skills, lessons that would pay off spectacularly just a few years later. Finian's Rainbow might not have struck gold at the box office, but it's a strange little stepping stone in Hollywood history. Sweet Charity, 1969. Bob Fosse's first film as a director should have been a knockout. After all, Fosse was already a Broadway legend, and with Shirley MacLaine in the lead, Sweet Charity had star power to spare. But what audiences got was a movie that dazzled in moments, yet struggled to find its rhythm, leaving theaters nearly empty. The story followed Charity Hope Valentine, a dancer in New York searching for love and happiness. Fosse infused the film with his signature choreography, camera tricks, and jazzy style. Numbers like Rich Man's Frug were visually inventive, full of the angles and movements that would later define his work. But as dazzling as those sequences were, they couldn't save the movie from its long runtime and uneven pacing. The budget crept past $20 million, but box office returns didn't even come close to covering it. Critics were divided. Some praised the artistry, others dismissed it as hollow style over substance. Shirley MacLaine's performance was heartfelt, but audiences didn't warm to the bittersweet story. At a time when musicals were losing their shine, Sweet Charity simply arrived too late to the party. Looking back, the film has a cult reputation. Fosse's fingerprints are all over it, and his later triumphs in Cabaret and All That Jazz wouldn't exist without this experimental first step. Sweet Charity may have been a box office bomb, but as a piece of film history, it's a fascinating glimpse at a director learning how to merge Broadway pizzazz with cinematic innovation. Is Paris Burning? 1966. With a title like that, you'd expect fire and fury. Instead, audiences got a meandering historical drama that failed to ignite. Is Paris Burning? Was meant to be a sweeping World War II epic, dramatizing the liberation of Paris from Nazi control. Packed with stars like Kirk Douglas, Anthony Perkins, and Alain Delon, it had the kind of international cast designed to guarantee box office appeal. The production spared no expense. Shot in black and white with a documentary-style approach, it aimed for authenticity and gravitas. Unfortunately, the final product felt more like a history lesson than a compelling drama. The runtime pushed nearly 3 hours, with countless subplots diluting the tension. Critics called it earnest but tedious, and audiences agreed. At the box office, the movie failed to justify its $6 million budget, performing weakly in both Europe and the United States. While the subject matter was important, the execution lacked the spark needed to keep viewers glued to their seats. Compared to other war dramas of the decade, it simply didn't deliver the emotional punch people expected. Still, for history buffs, the film has value. Its sweeping shots of Paris and careful attention to detail make it a time capsule of 60s war cinema. But in terms of box office performance, Is Paris Burning lived up to its title, just not in the way its producers intended. Che, 1969. Few films misfired harder than Che. This biographical drama attempted to tell the story of revolutionary leader Che Guevara, with Omar Sharif in the title role and Jack Palance playing Fidel Castro. The casting alone was enough to raise eyebrows, and the movie quickly became infamous for being wildly out of step with both history and public taste. The production was rushed, aiming to capitalize on Guevara's notoriety just 2 years after his death. But instead of a gripping portrait, audiences got a muddled, oversimplified narrative that leaned more on cliches than truth. Critics shredded it, calling it stiff, shallow, and at times unintentionally comical. Jack Palance, in particular, was criticized for an over-the-top performance that felt like parody rather than serious acting. Financially, Che was flopped immediately. The box office returns were dismal, with audiences actively avoiding it. The film's attempt to package a controversial figure into a glossy Hollywood biopic satisfied no one, neither critics, nor general audiences, nor historians. The $7 million budget vanished without a trace, leaving behind one of the decade's most notorious flops. Today, Che is remembered mostly as a cautionary tale about poor timing and worse execution. Even Sharif admitted later that the film was a mistake. What could have been a bold and timely drama instead became an embarrassing entry in both actors' filmographies. It's proof that sometimes Hollywood misjudges its audience so badly that failure is guaranteed before the opening weekend even ends. The Cardinal, 1963. This prestige drama aimed high. Directed by Otto Preminger, The Cardinal tackled weighty themes of morality, politics, and personal ambition, tracing the journey of a young priest as he rises through the ranks of the church. It was supposed to be thoughtful, dignified, and Oscar-worthy. Instead, it turned into an overlong, underwhelming project that bored audiences more than it moved them. At nearly 3 hours, the film demanded serious patience. The subject matter was dense, with heavy dialogue scenes that often felt more like lectures than drama. While the performances by Tom Tryon and Romy Schneider had their moments, the pacing dragged like quicksand. Critics were divided. Some admired its seriousness. Others called it tedious and self-important. The movie earned modestly, but failed to recoup its hefty $7 million budget. Audiences looking for escapism in the 60s weren't interested in spending hours watching a drawn-out tale of clerical politics. Compared to the colorful musicals and gritty thrillers hitting theaters at the same time, The Cardinal felt like homework. Still, it managed a few Oscar nominations, which gave it some prestige value. But in the end, that couldn't erase its financial disappointment. The Cardinal remains a reminder that serious intent doesn't always equal box office gold. Sometimes, even when a film is crafted with care, it can miss the emotional connection needed to keep audiences engaged. The Loved One, 1965. If you've ever wanted to see what happens when Hollywood takes a satirical novel and goes completely off the rails, look no further. The Loved One was marketed as the motion picture with something to offend everyone. That tagline turned out to be prophetic. Instead of drawing crowds, it scared them away. Based on Evelyn Waugh's novel, the film set its sights on America's funeral industry, delivering a dark comedy filled with eccentric characters and bizarre situations. Directed by Tony Richardson, it featured a sprawling cast that included Robert Morse, Jonathan Winters, and even a young Rod Steiger. On paper, it should have been sharp, witty, and groundbreaking. On screen, it came off as chaotic and alienating. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some admired its audacity, but most dismissed it as tasteless and mean-spirited. Audiences, meanwhile, stayed far away. With a budget of around $4 million, It never had a chance to recover its costs, especially as word of mouth spread that it was more strange than funny. Over time, however, The Loved One gained a cult reputation. Its morbid humor and outrageous set pieces make it fascinating in hindsight, even if it failed in its day. Today, it stands as one of the weirdest curiosities of the 60s, a film too strange for mainstream audiences, but too unique to disappear entirely. The 60s were supposed to be Hollywood's golden decade of spectacle, but as we've seen, some of the biggest productions fell flat on their glittering faces. From Cleopatra, nearly sinking a studio, to The Loved One baffling everyone, these films prove that ambition doesn't always equal success. Which of these odd bombs have you actually seen? Drop your pick in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more strange stories from cinema history.